ASEAN is very important because ASEAN brings us all together in a larger family. And it's not just Singapore and Malaysia or Singapore and Indonesia, but also Thailand and Vietnam and Myanmar, the Philippines and Brunei, and Cambodia, Laos. And that creates another identity for us as Southeast Asians. If in your generation, you feel that you're not only citizens of Singapore, but also citizens of ASEAN, then many of the foreign policy problems that we face today will be easier to manage. Relationship between neighbors, between Thailand and Cambodia, between Vietnam and Cambodia, between Malaysia and Thailand, between Malaysia and Indonesia, between Singapore and Indonesia, and so on. And this is why, among all the 10 countries of ASEAN today, regional integration has become a powerful force. Despite all the problems, despite our differences, there's a deep sense that with the rise of China and India, if we don't come together and create a greater sense of community, we can be at a great disadvantage. And that's good for us. And if you look at Singapore today, we are already a macrocosm of ASEAN. In every school, in every college, in every university, we have large numbers of students from every ASEAN country. And putting ASEAN festivals together in any educational or cultural institution in Singapore is never a problem because you can always find ASEAN representatives in that community.
Okay, thank you, Minister Sir. You have a second question, this time on the ASEAN identity especially. You mentioned that inevitably there are tensions among nations, whether or not we try to hide them. There will always be tensions between countries, and perhaps in ASEAN sometimes these tensions have been brought out, for example, say Malaysia, Thailand, or the Myanmar situation. So would you think that the creation of an ASEAN identity, which has been mooted by ASEAN, especially with the 40th anniversary of ASEAN last year, would you think that it would aid greatly in improving relations between nations, as then they would have a common understanding on issues? Or do you think that an ASEAN identity is perhaps not attainable in the coming few years, in the near future, as tensions and the differences between countries are actually too great to bridge within this short period?
There are always problems. There are always problems in ASEAN. And sometimes year by year, progress seems slow. But if we take a step back and look at ASEAN over 5 years, over 10 years, then you can see we have made enormous progress, enormous strides. Last year, I sat next to the permanent secretary of the British Foreign Ministry. And he was quite frank. He said, frankly, I don't feel very European. But my son feels much more European than me. For an earlier generation of Europeans, it was a political response, first to the slaughter of the Second World War, and then to the threat of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And later, economic competition from Japan, US, and other challenges. Now increasingly, worries about instability in the Middle East. It started as a coal and steel community, then a custom union, then a common market, then enlargement. And after the Cold War fell, more and more countries. And the result is remarkable. Never before in European history have the tribes of Europe lived as peacefully as they did in the last 60 years. Those of you who read history, who are familiar with the history of Europe, will know that there's no century when they didn't have very big wars, killing lots of people. And that should be an inspiration to us in Southeast Asia, that we too can perhaps aspire to such a reality. It doesn't mean that our problems will all be solved, but at least when there are disputes, when there are conflicts, there are ways to resolve them in a civilized way. As Churchill said, better jaw than war. Better to talk and talk, meetings, referendums, more meetings, more discussions, than to say mobilization, deploy. Last year, we celebrated 60, 40, 30. 60 years of Europe, 40 years of ASEAN, 30 years of ASEAN-Europe partnership. Nice round numbers. In the last 40 years, ASEAN has helped to keep the peace in Southeast Asia. And if ASEAN can continue to keep the peace in Southeast Asia, and somehow bring the bigger countries along, China, India, Japan, Australia, and then the US and Europe, then we can keep the peace in the whole of Asia for another generation. If we can do that, it will be a completely different Asia. Without peace, there can be no proper education of young people, there can be no good infrastructure, no proper functioning of the economy. And that is what ASEAN should try to achieve. But to do that, as what the British bumsack told me, the young people should feel much more a sense of the region than their fathers. And if you feel a greater sense of ASEAN, then our future is bright. But if you feel a lesser sense of ASEAN than your parents, then I think there'll be trouble. For this reason, every year on 8 August, when we celebrate ASEAN Day, we are trying to widen the activities and to involve more people, not just officials, but also students and businessmen and artists and so on, so that it becomes a part of our common inheritance. In Europe, they have many things, the Erasmus program, the Eurovision Song Contest, Euroreel, in order to encourage young people to know one another, and maybe to fall in love, maybe to intermarry, and to remove a sense of boundaries. We should try to do that in Southeast Asia.